Then let's listen as we hear the way in which Mark takes some of the images of that psalm as he describes Jesus' death. They compelled a passer-by who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. And they offered him some wine mixed with myrrh, but he didn't take it. And they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of a charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified 2 bandits, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha! You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves, saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him mocked him also. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let's see whether Elijah will come and take him down." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was God's Son." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So let's sing the hymn, "O Sacred Head Sore Wounded." Okay. Well, we won't sing that hymn. My God, why have you forsaken me?" That cry is deeply embedded in the psyche of so many Australians. My God, why have you forsaken me?" I can imagine that cry as those poor wretches were loaded into boats and locked below decks and made their perilous sea voyage to this country back in 1788. I can imagine that was the cry of those who guarded them as they arrived in this inhospitable country, a place so foreign to all their experiences, yet condemned by others to make their home here among a mob of convicts. I can imagine that cry from the indigenous people of this land, who found themselves invaded by boat people with superior weapons and a fear of this strange land, fears so real that they could only destroy the local inhabitants and try and drive them away. And this has been the cry of vast numbers of Australians ever since. Those who tried to explore this vast land, those who tried to farm this land of droughts and flooding rains, of beauty and terror, those who went to war on our behalf, and we're only now beginning to understand and take seriously the reality that those who returned bore an horrendous cost, as well as those who died. This is the cry of many individuals who are tormented by drug addiction, domestic violence and abuse, unemployment, floods, fires, cyclones, and any number of natural disasters. It's the cry of the small business person who loses all they have worked for years and wonders what now they can do. It's probably been repeated by many hundreds of subsequent refugees who set out from their awful life to find a better life, only to find themselves imprisoned, little better than the place they left. It seems it's the one thing that unites all Australians, this existential fear of God-forsakenness. And in some way, to a greater or lesser degree, we all know what that feels like. Yours may not have been a single horrendous encounter with pain or tragedy. It may have been an accumulation of cuts and bruises. It may feel as if you've been flogged over and over again. It may be an experience of rejection or shame or failure or mocking. You may have felt beaten down rather than strung up. But that sense of doubt and fear lurks. And if only you had the courage, you might cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because of this cry of dereliction so deeply embedded in the Australian experience, we see so few who want to have anything to do with the church. They have an image of God who is supposed to be wise and loving Father, who has the power to make us all happy and miraculously solve our problems and heal our diseases, fix everything up. And that God has failed or simply ignored us. The modern contemporary Christian message is usually about resurrection and triumph, about success. It implies that those who follow Christ will have a happy, fulfilled and prosperous life. Let's not dwell on the negative, we're told. There are even churches who will have no Friday service at all, but will only want to celebrate Resurrection Sunday. But the trouble is, as I wrote in the New Wave this week, you can't have resurrection without dying. But this triumphalism was not always the Christian message. Some time ago, the Reverend Dr. Jeff Thompson, who was a former principal of the Trinity Theological College, pointed out that a simple inspection of the Gospels tells a very different story to that triumphal story we so often hear. He points out that Matthew's Gospel has 2 long chapters from the Last Supper to the death of Jesus, and 1 short chapter about resurrection. Mark has 2 long chapters about the Last Supper through to the death of Jesus, but 1 very short, almost 1 paragraph about resurrection. Luke has 2 chapters from the Last Supper to the death of Jesus, and just 1 about resurrection. And John's Gospel has 7 chapters from the Last Supper to the death of Jesus, and only 2 about resurrection. Paul, in his letter to the church in Corinth, says, I preach Christ crucified. Despite Jesus' cry of dereliction, appearing like a massive failure to achieve anything, the symbol of Christianity became the cross. Nobody ever suggested that we wear little symbols of an empty tomb around our necks. Our churches are adorned with crosses and crucifixes, not open graves. Why would any people seeking to identify with a great leader choose the symbol of his greatest failure to identify themselves? What made the first century Christians see the cross not as failure, but as triumph? We know that Jesus feared this moment. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he prayed that this cup might be taken from him. Why do I have to go through this? He asked his Father. Yet despite knowing that it would be difficult, he didn't run away. He didn't flee from it. He didn't even pretend that it was all okay and that he was strong enough to bear it. Before his accusers, he stood strong. Before Pilate, he was bold. He accepted the mocking and abuse from the soldiers. He even prayed, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." All this seems noble and courageous and would have been the marks of a great leader worth following. Jesus could have died the noble martyr. But then he spoilt it all by admitting his deep humanity as he cried out in anguish, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And in that moment, at that point of total failure and desolation, the glory of the cross is seen. In that moment when darkness fell, the cross shone out across all eternity. For there, in what seemed like total failure, the victory of God shattered history. The hymn writer says, "For God, the living God, stooped down to our estate. By death, destroying death, Christ opened wide life's gate." God, the one who created, the one who brought all this universe into being, had chosen to remain not the remote puppeteer, the miracle worker who helped the good and punished the bad, who wielded his power and authority from afar. God, the living God, became a human being and experienced all that the evil and viciousness of this broken world could throw at us, and he refused to grasp at his divinity. Jesus, the divine Son of God, chose to die, broken and powerless, rather than use his power to protect himself and destroy his enemies. Just as he taught his disciples, Jesus chose to love his enemies and to die rather than abandon us. His enemies taunted him. "Prove you're the Son of God. Come down from the cross." And if Jesus had chosen to do that, he could have proven that he was the Son of God, but he would have no longer identified with the pain and the suffering of this world. He could no longer stand with us in our worst human experiences with any integrity or credibility. When he was born, Jesus was called Emmanuel, God with us. And he has chosen to remain with us until the very end. When we come to the point of pain and horror, the feeling of isolation and abandonment, when we join that psalmist and Jesus and millions of human beings who've screamed these words of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me?" we can look at the cross and know that in that moment we have come closer to God than we will ever come to God. And this is the glory of the cross. We worship the crucified God, God who, having chosen to become fully human in Jesus, didn't back out when the going got tough. In the death of Christ, the divine Son of God, God showed that he would never abandon we humans that he created in his own image. and whom he has always loved. Last Sunday, we placed those hands on the cross. They represented the hands that put Jesus there, the hands that waved palm branches, and then were raised in anger when Jesus wouldn't do what we wanted. They were hands that simply reached out, wanting to touch this suffering one without knowing why we were drawn to him. Hands that reached out in pleading, wanting to know that God understood. Every hand there, whether it reaches out to the cross in anxious pleading, or as a fist of anger, or a feeling of shame, every hand there has touched the very source of our salvation. I've often said at funeral services, in our grief and pain, we're often tempted to turn away from God in anger. We feel lost, let down, bereft. We feel all sorts of mixed emotions, and the tendency is to turn away from God, disappointed that God's allowed this to happen. All the talk about a risen, glorious God seems foreign and unapproachable when we're broken in grief. Yet the message of the Scriptures speaks so clearly that at that time we need to turn towards God. And even if it's with the psalmist to cry out in anger to God because we feel forsaken by God, but to turn towards God and share our depth of pain with him. And somehow, as we cry out in pain and anger, as we come to the cross of Christ, in the depths, we find the outstretched, scarred hands embracing us, holding us, drawing us closer. And so this morning I invite you to come again to the cross, to allow the love of the crucified God to sweep over you, to take away any feelings of bitterness or anger, fear, guilt, shame, whatever those emotions that would drag you down. Allow the love of the crucified God to overwhelm you and banish all the darkness. Because here we discover the shining light of the cross of Christ, who died that we might live. Amen.